Hi, Justin. Thank you for joining us on today's podcast. We're very happy to have you. I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we can get into some of the questions we have for today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jaume. So I'm Justin. I'm one of the founders and the CEO here at Tato. Tato was basically created out of need from my career as a consultant. I spent a decade doing ERP implementations, starting as a software engineer, growing the software engineering team, and then eventually working on the data and AI practice at the firm. So I got to see projects from the ground, kind of being assigned to a project full time, being on site, all the way to selling a project and overseeing its execution. Got to see a lot of different scenarios that were quite painful sometimes. And then when the ChatGPT moment happened, I was like, we need to have a virtual colleague.
There must be a better way.
There must be a better way. And so we're setting out to create this virtual colleague that's going to help do really good ERP implementations and large IT transformations. So yeah, that's basically who we are and who I am.
And so maybe in a nutshell, what is Tato exactly, if you had to describe it to a 5-year-old, as they say?
Yeah. So basically what it does is it's a virtual colleague that has an email address, and you invite that email address to your calls, your chats, your emails, your documents on SharePoint, and your applications on your project management applications like Azure DevOps, for example. And Tato will follow everything that's happening on your project and do what you would expect a project manager to do. So capture the risks, make sure that the scope is updated and that the evolution is captured. And we're actually really excited about this new functionality that's meant to generate reports for you so that you can spend less time gathering information and now start putting it together so that teams can focus on actually actioning the information. And actually, I'm really interested to talk to you about, how have you been using, because Lid started using Tato a few months back, and there's some really cool use cases that you enabled in the platform, and would
Absolutely.
love for you to tell the world about it.
Yeah, so Lid's been piloting this for the past few months now, I would say. Rolled it out to a lot of the Dynamics practice projects here. And to your point, it was a quick way to onboard the solution, but we started adding to the various clients and projects we were having. And to your point earlier on, it's essentially a perfect virtual colleague, right, that keeps track of everything that's happening in all of the meetings, the conversations, the Teams chats, whatever it might be.
It's not perfect yet.
It's not perfect yet. Perfect in the sense that it doesn't forget, I suppose. But no, yeah. So we started adding Tato to our projects and capturing all of the conversations that are happening in all of our projects that we're doing ERP implementations for. So the first use cases we were using it for was mainly as a repo of documentation, of scope, of decisions, of actions, of next steps, right? So we would go in and look at all our interactions we had over the past week, over the past month, and interact with the tool to say, what got said by who on what topic. And already there we were getting value out of the tool because, yes, of course, we're used to taking notes and just, sending recaps and all of that. But now we had a pretty complete and accurate set of data to help us in that exercise. The other part as well that we were using it for is obviously we have pretty large teams, large projects where a lot of stuff is happening and you can't always be on everything. So Tato was serving as a good recap for any meeting that was missed or any side conversations that were had, or when we have sometimes siloed teams, it was a good way to bring all of that back into one centralized platform and be able to interact with all of it. So that's kind of where we started with it.
So I'm curious, if you take us back to that starting point and you first heard about Tato, were you skeptical? How did you learn about it, and what was kind of your initial reaction?
Yeah, I'm skeptical by nature, I would say. So I was a little skeptical at first, but I think just the volume of data that was in there and the rapidness with which we were getting results from it quickly sort of took that skepticism away. I think using it kind of is what took my skepticism away. So, you know, as I was using it, I saw the value of having this AI-powered platform that was really just giving me the answers I needed without having to, you know, ping 30 different colleagues to get the answers. So the skepticism was there initially, but I think using it is what answered my concerns.
And did you immediately know where you wanted to use it, or like how did you guys go about saying, hey, like this thing or this process or workflow like is more painful? And
yeah, I think we did I suppose trial and error for a lot of these things. Not that there wasn't much error, but the barrier to entry is pretty low. It's quite intuitive to use, right? So we sort of, you know, trial and error, asked questions, got results from what we were trying to do, and by then we learned the platform. So, yeah.
What is the workflow or like short list of workflows that were kind of identified as being most painful, and like where would you say was the biggest win?
Right. Definitely documentation. So in all of our project steps throughout the implementation, you know, there's reports, there's documentation, there's notes, there's a lot of stuff happening and a lot of stuff we need to produce to make sure that we're keeping track of what's being decided and what we're going to implement, right? So that was one of the first time savers, and then we're going to get to reporting in a second. But just having a centralized place for all of that documentation and be able to extract it automatically, essentially, whether that was after a discovery session or after just a stakeholder update or whatever the different meetings and types of meetings we're having in our projects, a way to quickly extract the recap of it, essentially, whether that was for a particular meeting or for a bunch of meeting over a certain time frame. Just getting that out in a standardized, formalized fashion was one of the biggest time savers right away.
I wonder if you can answer this for me, because what's going through my head is like, I know that if I was saying this to someone, their next question would probably be, how are you different than Copilot in those scenarios? So how has Tato been different than Copilot?
Yeah, a good question. So the way I see it is, yes, you can get now these meeting recaps with Copilots, but what we're achieving here is a certain vertical scale of all of this. So it's not a one-to-one, it's a project per project, and it's aggregating a whole bunch of interactions, right? If we think of a typical implementation project, we're probably having 5,000 to 10,000 interactions over the course of many months. And so right now, there's just no way of doing that with Copilot to accurately recap and summarize and slice up conversational data that's been had over the bunch of months of the project. So I think that's where the real difference lies, is this is a purpose-built platform that, yes, uses transcription and AI vectorization, and you'll know this better than me, but we don't have it at the same scale as Copilot does today.
Nice.
Does that make sense?
It's awesome to hear it from the user.
Yeah. And then, so the next use case we've been using Tato as is, rather than just chatting with the tool and getting the answers on a user per user basis, we've started obviously to standardize and format reports, right? So I think that's the next big thing where this is going is, we're used to producing reports, whether that's a stakeholder meeting recap, user stories to develop, post-discovery sessions, solution blueprints, whatever the type of document is. It's always the result of design conversations, workshops, meetings, whatever it might be. And so now we have a way to create templates for these reports where we define the format and the structure of everything we want in it. And then we just have to run that against a project for a time frame or against a certain interaction. And we get a pre-formatted, pre-designed report that contains essentially the information we want to expose, right? So that's been a huge time saver as well, where we've sort of removed some of the clerical work we're doing, and now we're just focusing on delivering value, which is how do we solution the problem, how do we design, and how do we think about implementing this particular feature, for example, versus spending hours documenting it in Word kind of thing.
So one thing that I find really special about you as a person individually is you're involved both in sales and in delivery.
Yeah.
And oftentimes with our customers and the consulting firms that we speak with, that's a separate group of people. And one of the most challenging kind of use cases is people gather a lot of information during the sales cycle,
right,
and then after that, the delivery teams are expected to deliver on the expectations that were gathered during the sales cycle. But I'm curious, from your point of view, being involved in both,
Yeah.
how does it help in the sales cycle? How does it help in delivery? And how does the world bridge the gap between those two things?
I think the thing you're hitting on here, which if we generalize it, is knowledge transfer. So in the pre-sales cycle, or in the sales cycle, I should say, we're getting a lot of preliminary information about timeline, budget, scope, to some extent, features that we know might be complicated, or current gaps, challenges the customer has, and the reasons why they're potentially implementing a new ERP. So there's a lot of content there that's already being discussed, and typically the teams are different, right? You've got the pre-sales team, and then you've got your implementation team. And so there, if we start capturing a lot of that information from the pre-sales conversations, well, the knowledge transfer to the team should, and hopefully if we win the project, is facilitated by Tato. So I don't need to spend 2 hours explaining what got said over the past month in the pre-sales cycle. Someone can go in and just get the recap and understand where we're starting from. And the generalization of that is, well, even post-implementation, once we go into sort of support and continuous improvements, well, the same thing applies, right? If we've got a consultant coming in 3 months after the project has gone live and he's wondering what we did on XYZ, all of that documentation and all of those decisions that were made is captured in the platform. And so it's a recollection base, I suppose, that's available for anyone who's coming into the project at a later date. That's
awesome.
Great use case. We've been using it for too.
When we started the company, we said, we have to start by focusing on a certain lens, which was project management.
Right.
And that's where we started. And then one of the very first users who enabled us to actually put some effort on a non-project management use case is when you brought up that solution blueprint requirement. And I can't overstate how excited we were internally. Like, we were just all rattled up at the idea that we would now have all this information that came from various different workshops and conversations, and we would turn it into a solution blueprint and hopefully generate a ton of value, not just for project management's purpose, but for the solution consultants and the people who are actually in front of the customer, delivering value.
Yeah.
And I think that's really working with Lid and yourself, that's enabling us to deliver on our entire vision, which is ultimately to transform the entire life cycle of these massive transformation projects, right? It doesn't begin and end with delivery. It begins when you're selling the project, and it really ends never, because after the project is delivered, then you're supporting the customer. So I think that was really interesting. But I'm curious if you have an idea of what are the next use cases and where do you go from here? How do you enable the team to start using it a lot more? And how do you tackle, now that you've kind of proven out that, okay, there's some value, how do we actually make this a business-wide thing?
Yeah. So I think that the strategy, to your point, is start small with a subset of projects, which is kind of where we're at now. We've proved it works for our typical projects with a controlled fashion where we have some people that are using it, not everyone just yet. Now the question and part of the roadmap to deploying this is making sure that people know how to use it, know in what cases to use it, and we just start adding it to all of our projects that we're deploying, from the pre-sales to the support there. So implementing this at scale means just bringing in more users, and by definition, that also means having a bit more guardrails than we've had right now. But as I said before, the barrier to entry is pretty low. So adding this to other projects, once we've proven out that it works for one, is a pretty easy task, because you just, to your point before, you add the project assistant there or the Tato to your calls, and off you go, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's going to be more making sure people know what they can get out of it and how to use the tool, and how to make the most of it, than a real sort of logistic barrier to entry there. Yeah.
Have you gotten resistance from customers?
Personally, no. So there's always a bit of a question mark as to, hey, who's this recorder that's now on our Teams meetings? Yeah. But other than that, once we explain that we're using this tool to facilitate documentation and requirement gathering and decision and risks tracking, it helps them, right? So it's helping us help our customers. So so far the answer's always been great. We have a good recollection of what's happening.
Awesome.
Yeah. Maybe you can finish us off with sort of where are you seeing the next steps of Tato and where you hope the platform is going to go?
Yeah. So right now, our focus is we have a lot of information, like basically documenting everything inside of project management. The big feedback that we're getting from our users is it can be quite noisy. There's, more risks than would typically get recorded by humans, which everybody kind of assumes is going to happen with AI. But then when the risks are presented to you and you're tasked with mitigating those risks and making sure that you're on top of everything, it can get overwhelming.
Right.
So I think the next stage of Tato is about taking all of this data and adding another layer of intelligence to really extract the best insights to make sure that you're getting everything you need to be able to focus on the risks and the elements of your project that matter most. So that's where we're hyper-focused at the moment. And I don't know what shape or form that's going to take over the next few months, but there's a lot of really cool things that the team is working on.
So is that building in the user feedback sort of earlier on versus just exposing, here's everything we have and sort through the noise? We're trying to get more input from the users beforehand kind of thing?
Exactly. And it's about having the human in the loop for various different aspects. Because I think if you kind of look at AI enabling humans to do smart things, if the AI tries to do the entire thing, I think humans will agree that it's not good enough to do the entire thing. But it can be a massive enabler if the human can provide inputs at various stages of the process and the AI can do a lot of the grunt work.
Right.
And so we're trying to figure out, now that we've had to kind of establish this foundation that seems pretty solid, how can we turn that into a human in the loop process where you're taking this data and it just feels natural for the human to work on it, and it doesn't slow them down, but it speeds them up. Because having access to all this information was step one.
Right.
Now you feel like you have better visibility, you feel like you can't forget things, and that's fantastic. But now we got to make that information really useful.
Right. One thing we haven't touched on yet, but I wanted to mention it, is the original skepticism I had was also concerning reliability of the information. So you run a report, you get a version of it, which seems perfect and great. You run the report again, you get essentially the same thing, but in slightly different words. And so I think part of the user experience and getting used to using AI in these different aspects of our work is also being okay with that and making sure that we're getting the results, but maybe the format of it is slightly different.
Yeah.
But I think one thing where Tato has helped, where Tato has helped in that is you always go back through to the original source, which I think is a pretty cool concept you have that not everyone else has. So if I have a report and I see something's being said or recapped in there, I can drill back to the original source conversation and even to the same transcript. And so that sort of confirms and gives confidence in the data that's being shown, because you can go all the way back to the source that was there. So I'm curious if you're doing any sort of improvements or if that's been a concern for others in terms of the reliability of the data.
It has been a concern from day one. And initially, when we were shooting a little bit wider, it was very obvious that there were certain scenarios where there was a hallucination or something was flat out wrong because of the interpretation that was wrong, because he took a different angle than was desired by the user. So I think our approach is kind of twofold there. It's, yes, always make sure that the data lineage is exposed. So if you're looking at a risk, you should know that it came from a conversation. You should know that interpretation came from the words that were said. That's true everywhere. And then if that risk is used in a report, the data lineage has to continue later down the chain. The other thing is having specialized workflows and specialized agents, because if I give you a fact of something that happened on a project and I approach it from a decision perspective, I'm trying to extract a decision, I'm going to ask different questions than if I approach that same thing from a risk perspective.
Right.
And that's what we've been kind of perfecting over the last few cycles is, how can we get really good at generating the right agents? Because our job for the next 10 years is probably going to be create a bunch of agents that are hyper specialized that generate vertical value for the users. But what we need to do is prioritize the right ones. And so that's what the name of the game has been. It's like, that's why being verticalized on these ERP and IT transformation projects is helpful, because if you were looking at a construction project, the agents probably wouldn't be the same.
I see. Yeah. And so is that also one of the distinctions you have with something like Copilot, who probably is more of a generalist AI versus something hyper specialized into, implementing IT projects or that sort of work.
But even so, I always say, like, the talk track changes, right? Of what are we and what are we not, and what doesn't change is that we're specialized on these types of projects. What Copilot does and doesn't do changes over time, because they include new features and stuff like that, right? Like this morning, I was reading a post from Sam Altman, who was excited about announcing Pulse. And Pulse is this thing that's only available to the pro users on ChatGPT, but eventually will allow anybody to have ChatGPT think on their behalf about a bunch of things that could be useful for them in the future, being very proactive instead of reactive.
Right.
Like from day one, our whole value has been, we know that you need your notes in your meeting, but there's a bunch of tools that provide notes for your meetings. That's not where we'll add very good value.
Right.
Where we'll add value is everything that happens afterwards. It's, you took great notes, but then what did you do with the risks that came out? And what happened with the evolution of that risk, and did it get mitigated, or did it blow up and become a big problem? And when it did become a problem, did the customer say, you never told me about this, but in fact you had told them 10 times about it? So like it's that whole making data more valuable over time and being proactive about it, because we know what you expect, because we know ERP projects.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, thank you very much, Justin. I think those are nice closing remarks, and we'll keep it open-ended on that. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast today, and we're looking forward to the next releases here of Tato and pushing this out to our company-wide users.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thanks again for the partnership. I think we couldn't do this without you guys.
Absolutely, we're very grateful. Thanks.
Right.